So good afternoon to everyone who's joined us for this very important webinar today on implementing the new UK clinical trials regulations. I'm James Pound, the Interim Executive Director for Innovation and Compliance at the MHRA, and I'll be chairing you through today's session with colleagues from both MHRA and HRA. And I'll now pass to Dr. June Raine, the MHRA Chief Executive, for opening remarks.
Well, thank you, James, and good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome indeed to today's important webinar on the implementation of the new clinical trials regulations. We are in a very exciting time in the evolution of clinical trials in the UK. And I'm pleased to share with you that we're now in the position of intending to lay in Parliament before the end of this year a new legislative framework for clinical trials, with implementation over the following 12 months. As you may be aware, this follows an extensive consultation through 2022 and 2023, over 2,000 responses, with the government response being published in March 23. And following the outcome of consultation on proposals for legislative changes for trials, we've been working to develop the regulations and follow parliamentary process. Since then, our new government has endorsed the proposals set out in the consultation response, and it is clear from the strong focus on clinical research, in prescription for growth and elsewhere, that clinical trials will play a key role in our developing life sciences ecosystem. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency and the Health Research Authority are fully committed to playing our respective parts in implementing these new regulations. And it's important to be clear about what the purpose is. Number one, to ensure patients and their safety are at the focus of all clinical trials and bring the benefits of clinical trials to everyone. That we provide a new framework that is streamlined, agile, and responsive to innovation. That we create a proportionate and flexible regulatory environment around some of the amazing new science and technology. And last but not least, that we cement the UK as a destination for international trials. Earlier this week, and I hope you've seen it, the joint informal consultation from MHRA and HRA on draft inclusion and diversity guidance was published. And that's a really important step forward. This guidance will help ensure research is designed to include people who could be impacted by the findings, and people underserved by research are not overlooked. So we fervently hope that this will help increase the diversity of people taking part in clinical trials and clinical investigations. I know how important a patient-focused, innovation-enabling, risk-proportionate regulatory framework is for clinical trials, and it is to everyone on today's call. And whether you're a patient or a researcher or a clinician in the health service, it matters to you too, so it matters to us. Successful implementation of the new regulations is of the highest priority for the MHRA, and I know certainly this will be the case for HRA too. So the hope is that you will find today's webinar informative and helpful as we begin our programme of engagement with you. And I very much look forward to our work together to deliver for patients and research across the UK and wider. And it's only by working together that we'll all be able to take full advantage of this once-in-a-generation opportunity. So back to you, James, to steer the ship forward through this exciting programme.
Thank you very much, June, and for joining us for those opening remarks. So I'll be taking everybody through today's webinar. We've got a couple of hours set aside for that, and I'll just talk through the agenda at a high level. We'll be starting with some legislative updates, and that comes from colleagues within the partnerships group of MHRA. We'll then be talking through in some more detail the plan for developing the guidance, and that's from both organisations, and how we'll be involving you throughout that process. We'll conclude that section with a look at our clinical trials roadmap, so the delivery of the new regulations, implementation, transition. And then we'll have an open Q&A, a chance for folks who are on the call to submit questions, and you should have received a link through Slido to do that. And I'll be chairing that with contributions from colleagues from MHRA and HRA. And then we'll have some closing remarks and some call to action to all of you attending on what will happen next and how to get involved. So without further ado, we'll move to the next item in the agenda, which is the details of the legislative process progress we've made with the new regulations. And I'm joined by my colleague, Freya Newton from MHRA's partnership group. So over to you, Freya.
Thanks very much, James, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Freya Newton, working in MHRA to deliver regulatory reform for clinical trials. So this section that I'm going to deliver is to provide a legislative update on clinical trials, provide an overview of the changes, and then the expected timings of those changes. So if we can just move on to my first slide. Thank you very much. So we are reforming the clinical trial regulations in line with those four main themes on the screen. The aim is to enable faster patient access to pioneering safe treatments by creating a more proportionate and flexible regulatory environment. So we launched a public consultation on those proposed changes in 2022, and we published the response in 2023. So the next couple of slides that I'm going to deliver will give a very top-line overview of what is changing in the clinical trial regulations. More detail on those changes will be available through the production and publication of guidance, which will be covered by colleagues later in the presentation. In the meantime, if you'd like to know more, I would direct you to the consultation response, which is available on gov.uk, and that sets out in detail the key reforms that will be made. A link to the consultation should be available on your screens, or if not, you can find it by Googling consultation on legislative proposals for clinical trials. So if we could move to the next slide, please, I will start to go into some of the changes that you can expect to see. So this slide covers the changes to the approval process. So the changes to the approval process are to simplify and streamline the approval of clinical trial applications. So a single application route will become embedded into the legislation with a coordinated regulatory and ethics review, and that will lead to a single UK decision for a clinical trial. The review timelines for applications will also be updated to ensure flexibility and competitiveness. For example, a combined decision will be issued within 30 days post-validation. Lastly, in the approval process, a notification scheme for initial clinical trial applications will also be embedded in legislation to enable a more streamlined and risk proportionate approach, and that will reduce the time to get lower risk clinical trials up and running without undermining patient safety. Through the notification scheme, a sponsor can notify the MHRA about eligible clinical trials and gain automatic regulatory approval. Some modifications will also be notifiable, which will be modifications of an important and administrative details, such as change of the sponsor's legal representative. So if we could move to the next slide, please. This slide covers the changes to research transparency. So a legislative requirement will be introduced for trials to be registered on a public registry before they begin, and a summary of results to be published within a year of the trial ending. Sponsors may request a deferral of these transparency requirements to protect commercially confidential information, or in exceptional circumstances may also request a waiver. There will also be a legislative requirement to offer a summary of the results with participants that is understandable to laypersons and also in a suitable format. We can move to the next slide, please. This slide covers the changes to good clinical practice. So currently, the ICH GCP Good Clinical Practice Guidelines are followed where trials are conducted to support a marketing authorization, but this is not a UK legislative requirement. the new legislation will require compliance with the overarching principles of good clinical practice. This would update the provisions on good clinical practice to align with the principles of ICH guidelines. This will ensure international standards are met and UK clinical trial data is accepted globally. If we could move on to the next slide. This slide here covers the changes to manufacturing and assembly. So the new legislation introduces a definition of non-investigational medicinal products, which are often used in support of a clinical trial, but are not the actual subject medicine of the trial, which would allow the concept to be extended to non-medicinal products, such as challenge agents. The current exemption for holding of a manufacturing authorization, specifically for investigational medicinal products, will also be extended to include diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals within a clinical trial. And lastly, in manufacturing and assembly, there will be greater flexibility for the requirements for labelling clinical trial medicines, for example, by enabling a licensed medicinal product that is subject to the trial to have reduced specific clinical trial labelling where appropriate. And if we can move on to the last slide, this slide here of the changes relates to changes to safety reporting. So at the moment, there are safety reporting requirements that are duplicative and do not contribute to patient safety. The new legislation will reduce these duplicative reporting requirements. We're also removing the requirements for listings of serious adverse events and serious adverse reactions in annual safety reports, and instead a narrative of how safety concerns have been evaluated and interpreted. So if we can move on to my final slide, that covers the top line overview of how the changes can be expected. The final slide from me is an overview of the timelines of the legislation and where we currently are in the process. So following the general election, we have gained ministerial approval to continue with our plans to reform the clinical trial regulations. So we've continued with the legal drafting in line with the proposals set out in the public consultation, and that is currently in the final stages of legal checks and parliamentary processes that need to take place. So pending those parliamentary processes, the aim is to lay the legislation in November this year. Following the laying of the legislation, parliamentary debates will then take place. Following those debates and the legislation then being passed, a 12-month implementation period will follow. So we are currently predicting that the new regulations will be implemented in January 2026. But this, of course, is dependent on when the regulations are debated and then passed. So there will be clear transitional arrangements of how we are moving from the old rules to the new rules, and more details will be released in the coming months. So thank you very much for your time. That is all from me. Back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Freya, for that very comprehensive overview of the key changes in our new regulations and the timelines associated with them. One thing I should have flagged at the beginning of today's webinar is that we will be providing a copy of the webinar, including the slides that will be circulated to attendees after this meeting. And I know a few folks have been asking that question in the webinar chat. Also to note that the Q&A that we'll be having later, we're very much focused on the process for engaging you on guidance. The actual material questions in relation to the new guidance will be covered in those sessions, so won't be covered today. Please can you also submit those questions via Slido and not to the chat for the webinar. So that is www.slido.com, and then the event code is #clinicaltrials24. That's all one word and with a capital C and a capital T. I think it should be in your emails that were sent out when you registered. So the next item we'll be coming to the agenda is looking at the plan for actually developing that guidance and how we'll be going about them. We're joined by colleagues from across both organisations. So Andrea Manfrin, who's our Deputy Director in Clinical Investigations and Trials at MHRA, Jason Wakeland-Smith, who comes from our compliance teams and brings the expertise on good clinical practice, and Catherine Blewett from HRA. So I'll now pass to Dr. Manfrin, who'll start the next section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and good afternoon, everybody. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the first is to reflect on the development of the guidance. So the guidance are extremely important to enable the sponsor to prepare and submit the clinical trial to the HRA and the MHRA. They do not exist in a vacuum, and we are willing to co-author and work with internal partner and external partner as well. We are giving consideration to other regulatory guidance. And we would like to, and we are eager to have this opportunity to engage with the stakeholder to get your input and co-development in the guidance. And we are very, very open to your feedback as well. If I can get to the next slide. So we divided the guidance into 7 main topics. The first one is the request of approval for clinical trials. That will provide all the details and the processes that you need to follow to submit the clinical trial submission to us. And then we have the modification to clinical trial approval. We introduced this name, so modification instead of amendment. So in the future, what is called amendment right now will be called modification in the new clinical trial regulations and guidance as well. And as pointed out by my colleague Freya, on number 3, we are introducing the notification for clinical trial initial and clinical trial amendment as well, according to specific criteria. Then there will be a section on safety, followed by a section on research transparency, another section on seeking and recording consent, and the last section will be on ending a clinical trial. If I can go to the next slide, please. And I'm passing all now to my colleague, Jason.
So outside of the updates which Andrea's just mentioned, there'll also be a number of other updates to the clinical trial legislation. So these can really be bucketed into these 3 sort of approaches. So there are broad changes, so changes to broad topics such as the adoption of ICH GCP 6R3 principles, the enshrinement of risk proportionality and risk assessment within the legislation, and then greater transparency for sponsor responsibilities and oversight. The next bits are specific changes, and these particularly relate to things like archiving requirements, so for the retention of records for a longer period of time, labelling of investigational medicinal products, and some aspects around radiopharmacy. And then finally, there are updates which don't really apply to trialists per se, because they either relate to regulatory functions, such as minor tweaks to offences, to offences, for example, or things like the Declaration of Helsinki is still in there, but we're just making a slight tweak as to how to refer to it. So I'll pass on at that point.
Thank you very much. So hello everyone, I'm Catherine Blewett. I'm leading on the work to develop and implement the clinical trial regulations from the Health Research Authority side of things. Now, whilst the HRA is working very closely with the MHRA to develop the broader suite of guidance, which Andrea has just gone through, there are some areas which the HRA is leading on, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about those areas. So firstly, the new regulations will include provisions relating to transparency for clinical trials. So the HRA will be undertaking some engagement work over the next couple of months to develop the detail for that guidance. So this will cover things like how the deferral request mechanisms will work in practice, and expectations around arrangements for offering a lay summary of results to participants and legal representatives, that kind of a thing. So this is really important to ensure that not only are sponsors and researchers supported to be able to meet their duties under the regulation, but also to ensure that processes can actually reasonably be delivered in practice. The outcome of this engagement work will then be reflected in guidance, which will be published next year. The regulations will also provide for a simplified means of obtaining and recording consent. So this will apply for trials which only involve an IMP which is authorised and being used within the terms of the authorisation, and the IMP is being prescribed in the course of a person's routine healthcare, and there are no additional interventions or diagnostic procedures, so sort of very, very low risk trials. And again, we'll be undertaking some engagement work on this topic over the next couple of months, and we'll be issuing a survey which is aimed at members of the public and also the research community to get views on what approaches would be acceptable. And then again, following on from that engagement work, we'll be publishing guidance next year. Now, the two other areas of guidance that are listed here aren't directly related to the regulations. The reason that we talk about them here is because they were areas which we consulted on as part of the public consultation. And whilst it was decided not to legislate for these particular areas, the government response to the consultation did make a clear commitment to issue guidance. So we still do refer to them in this context, even though they're not within the legislation itself. So firstly, inclusion and representation. So this aims to ensure that clinical trials include people who could reasonably be impacted by the research findings, and ensure that people who are commonly underserved by research are not being overlooked. The HRA have been working very closely with the MHRA to develop some key questions and supporting guidance for sponsors and researchers, which they can then consider when they're designing clinical trials. All of this will then form the basis of an inclusion and diversity plan. We currently have a survey open, which aims to get views on the questions and the guidance. So again, please do engage with that, and details of which can be found on the HRA website, and we can provide a link if anybody wants that. And we're also developing some guidance covering expectations relating to public involvement, and this is very much focusing on phase 1 healthy volunteer trials, because we appreciate that there was a sort of a gap in the existing guidance for those particular types of trials. So this has been developed with input from the phase 1 advisory group, and we should be in a position to publish guidance very soon. On a more general note, we do very much welcome involvement in the development stage of our guidance, as well as views and comments on published guidance, so that we can update and improve it on an ongoing basis. So we do encourage everyone to please get involved with this work to develop the guidance. We will be communicating these opportunities or how to get involved with these particular pieces of work via some of our standard communication routes. So we have the HRA latest and also the clinical trials update. So if you haven't already, please do sign up to these communication channels. And we will also be running some webinars through 2025 to update on various pieces of work. So please also do look out for these. So I will now pass back to Andrea Manfred.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So the work that we have conducted together with HRA is summarized in 5 steps. So the first one is the guidance drafted. So we drafted the guidance, and we are now in the position to start the engagement activity with all the stakeholders. We are looking to get your feedback, advice, and recommendation, and this will be will help us to create the final draft. Once we will have the final draft will be shared again with some stakeholders to get further comments, and this will allow us to get the final version of the guidance. We can go to the next slide. In this slide, we are just summarizing the timelines for the guidance. So between November and March 2025, we will conduct engagement activity with the stakeholders, and then from March until April 2025, we will create the final draft with the guidance that will be published. This will be followed in April and June 25 by further comment and the final guidance. And we are aiming to publish the final version of the adopted guidance in August 2025. And in January 2026, the guidance will become live, and this will be subject to parliamentary process. If I can go to the next slide, please. So I'm now just summarize with my next slide the roadmap for the clinical trial. This roadmap is divided in mainly 3 blocks. The first is the parliamentary process, the second is the development of draft guidance, and the third is the finalized guidance. So the first step is the development of the guidance that started in 2024, and now we are reaching the point, as mentioned already by our CEO, Dr. June Rain, we are nearly ready to submit the new clinical trial regulation to the Parliament. In parallel, during 2024, we started to work on the guidance, and now we are reaching the point that we're going to start the engagement activity with you. And we are really willing to work with you to get your comment and vision on the guidance. This will take us to the final step, where we are aiming to publish the guidance in August 2025, and then in January 2026, the guidance will become live. If we can get my next slide, please. In terms of activity and support, just going back to what Catherine said, we will be working with you. We're going to share the draft and the documents that we have produced. We would like to create workshop and organize workshop to share information and get your feedback. We will create and develop webinars as well when required. And also for the work in progress, we will host, the information on our website as well. And for the application, we are linking text, and we're going to place this on the guidance to highlight the changes. My next slide, please. In terms of involvement with the MHRA, we divide the involvement in 4 steps. The first one is that at the end of the seminar, within the next week or so, we're going to send an email with a survey. And this survey will help us to map your interest in the different domain of the guidance. This will allow us to identify the stakeholder that will help us to finalize the guidance. In the next step, which is number 2, we're going to create webinars with small engagement group that will help us to finalize the guidance. And then this will follow potentially by workshop as well, where we are working for the co-creation and for the final product of the guidance as well. All the information will be published on the gov.uk and will be promoted via email, social media, and all the other channels. And this will be an iterative approach, and we are really looking to engage with you. If I can get to my next slide, please.
And if we move to the next slide after that, if that's okay. So what have we covered today? We've had an important update on where we are with the legislation, and I hope everyone is pleased to see that we are estimating we'll be able to be laying before Christmas, and then there'll be that follow-on 12 months implementation period. I hope also stakeholders are very happy to hear that we have a plan to very much involve and engage you proportionately in the development of that guidance, and that we want to make sure that it's in place well ahead of the implementation of the new regulations, so that you're able to prepare your organisations and businesses well in advance of that. Andrea talked us through that clinical trial roadmap, so very much setting out the timeframes around regulation, around developing of guidance and implementation. And certainly I think that Q&A session has been incredibly helpful for us at MHRA to understand what some of your concerns are. The key bit, if I go back to some of the earlier presentations, was around how you can get involved. So do keep an eye out for that survey that Andrea mentioned. So an email with a link will be sent out following this session, and that will enable you to express an interest in different areas of guidance. So if your particular interest is, for example, in GCP and the compliance elements, or if it's to do with the ethics review elements, being able to indicate that to us. What that will do is enable us to understand where there's a potential representative collection of individuals or organisations that we could then go ahead and engage when we're developing the guidance. And that could be anything from sharing drafts, but also potentially small engagement groups or some small co-creation workshops. It will vary depending on the type of guidance in question. And clearly it will be important to us that any activity we undertake under that remit is representative of the various stakeholders who are involved in those pieces of work. So do keep an eye out for that. And I do very much encourage folks to get involved. We do want to do this together with you. We do want to make sure that the guidance is absolutely clear on what you'll need to be doing, and that it's available in sufficient time so that you can be ready ahead of implementation of the new regulation, so that for all of us, this can be a successful transition to the new regulations, and all of the benefits that we know will be in those new regulations are able to be brought to reality for yourselves as well as MHRA. So how can you keep updated in how we're getting on with this and what's happening? You'll see on that slide on the screen now that there are various web pages on HRA's website around the latest news and clinical trials update. That's where HRA will be keeping their updates. For MHRA, you've got that guidance survey I've talked around. There is the MHRA news that is circulated to stakeholders and that you can sign up for. And we'll also be using some of our social media presence. So for example, on LinkedIn, to keep you updated as well. I've talked about our commitment to getting this right. I've talked about our commitment to keeping you engaged, but also our commitment to keeping you aware of what's happening so that you understand the progress that we're making. So I'm sure we will be doing future webinars similar to this to bring you updates, let you know where we're up to. Obviously, plans change over time potentially. So if there are any changes, we'll also let you know. But again, committed to being transparent around this, engaging you as much as we can proportionately, and then really excited about looking to the implementation of the new regulations subject to parliamentary process towards the end of 2025 or beginning of 2026. With that, I'll bring our webinar to a close. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, for the excellent questions and feedback you've given us. and certainly to all of my colleagues from MHRA, from in the Clinical Investigations and Trials team, from our inspectors, from HRA colleagues and MHRA comms. Please do look out for us circulating the recording of the webinar, and also for that survey where you'll be able to indicate how you can get involved, and look forward to hearing you more in the future. So thank you very much, and we'll wrap up at that point today. Thank you.